So, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon if you're on the East Coast. I'm delighted to be here with you for this MTNA webinar, and very grateful to MTNA for giving me the opportunity to speak to you guys. Hello, Atlanta. Good morning or good afternoon, whichever it is for you there. Just before we get going, just a little bit of housekeeping. You can see the chat bar at the side there. If you have any questions for me, feel free to type them in there. I'm going to just do the presentation, keep going, and then I'll respond to the questions at the end. But feel free to write them as you go along, so I know sometimes you forget what your train of thought was. If for any reason we're out of time and I don't get to answer all those questions, my final slide will have my email address on it. You are very welcome to contact me and I can answer there, or we can also do that through the members only section on the MTNA website. I'll also be posting the slides on that on the members only section. So there are some references in there from some of the research I mentioned. So if you want to do further reading, you'll have access to those. And also the webinar will be there to review again if you want to sit through it all again. So that's the kind of housekeeping side of things. But just to introduce myself, my name is Jenny Morton. I'm an osteopath. You can probably tell from my accent I am originally from England, but I'm now living in Los Angeles, California. I spend a lot of my time treating injured musicians and working to help them get back to playing. I also help them just work on optimizing their playing. Let's find a way that we can make you more efficient with your playing, free up the artistry. And I'm also the wellness professor at the Colburn School, where I teach a wellness course that runs for the whole of the fall semester. All the freshmen, whether they're undergraduate, postgraduate, have to take this course. It's mandatory. And we cover everything from the anatomy of the body. How does your shoulder joint work? How do you fit that around a violin? Or we look at the anatomy of the spine, all those sorts of things. But we also look at the psychological aspect. What makes you creative? What does that do to your thought processes? Perfectionism, performance anxiety, all those things. And that's really what we're going to be sort of looking at today, because while we have become a lot better in recent years at addressing issues of postural alignment, ergonomics around the instrument in order to manage injuries, we perhaps haven't looked quite so closely at the psychological components. And thought processes are not just nebulous kind of things that are going on in our minds. There are tangible links to the physiology of our body, and actually we can increase our injury risk by the way we're thinking. And that's kind of what we're going to pick apart today. So I'm going to share my slides now. This may take a few seconds for them to come up, so don't worry if it doesn't come up straight away. But there we go. So you should be seeing those slides coming up now. So we're looking at the emotional practice environment. So whilst we can set ourselves up beautifully in terms of our body alignment in the practice room, are we doing the same? Are we paying the same level of attention to our thought processes? And why should we? Why is this important? So we're going to be looking at there's sort of a Western idea that everything in our head is some nebulous thought process that has no connection to the body, but anything that goes on in the brain is just chemical processes, it's electrical activity, and those are going to be spread throughout the whole body via the bloodstream, via our nervous system. And that's really what we're going to be exploring today. What are those connections and why do we need to be mindful of them? So I think we're kind of familiar these days, all too familiar, with the rather disappointing, shall we say, figures around injury risk in musicians. So this study from 2012 that looked at a huge number of orchestral musicians, classical orchestral musicians in Australia, basically found that there is an 84% lifetime prevalence of injury. So what that means is 84% of those musicians will experience an injury, and we're talking about something that actually prevents them from playing, rather than just, oh, it hurts a bit and I'm playing anyway. Something that has stopped them being able to play their instrument and do their job. 84% will experience that over the course of their professional career, and 50% are playing in pain at any given time. So these are horrible figures from an occupational health perspective. And, you know, we are doing a lot these days to look at injury prevention. But we also need to be looking at what are the psychological components of that, and making sure that we're really addressing all the jigsaw pieces that fit into this. So that they found in this study that, you know, common factors that predispose people to pain were training and playing load. So basically hours at the instrument, how many hours at the instrument. So for me, it's not just about how many hours you are playing your instrument, but it's also about what is the environment in which you are playing that instrument, be it the physical environment or the psychological environment. So I'm going to start off by referencing a couple of studies here that were done. These were done not on musicians, but looking at occupational health for people who sit at the desk all day and you know, typing on a computer, which is pretty analogous to playing an instrument. The use of the upper, what we call the upper extremities of the body, the shoulders, neck, arm complex. And what they found was that thought processes, so they call it mental load, basically mental activity can increase muscle activity. So how they studied this was they put electrodes on the muscles of the shoulder and arms, and these electrodes basically measure electrical activity in the muscle, i.e. is it active or not. And what they first of all had people just sitting absolutely still and just emptying their minds, not a thought, just sitting very quiet. And they looked at the electrical activity of the muscles, and they got a baseline reading. Then they asked these participants to think about something. So actually start cognitively waking up the mind and thinking about something. And they're not moving their bodies, they haven't physically moved at all, but the electrical activity in the muscles went up. They then gave these participants a mental task to do, so some mental arithmetic or something that was challenging them cognitively, and muscle activity went up even higher. So these people are sitting still, not moving, just thinking, and muscle activity has increased. So this is something that probably may be a surprise to some of you, that you can be sitting absolutely still, but your muscles are active. And what that means is muscle tension. So you haven't even begun to play your instrument at this time. You've already got muscle tension in the system before you've begun to play. So we need to understand what's the mechanism that underlies this. What's going on there? How does that work? So it kind of brings us to a field of medicine known as psychoneuroimmunology, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it's known for short as the PNI system. So this comes from the world of integrative medicine, functional medicine. So this is a growing field of medicine that is looking at, rather than looking at individual systems within the body and saying, well, I deal only with the nerves and I deal only with the endocrine system or the skin or whatever, we start to look at how those systems interact together, because that's really how the human body works. It's an integrated structure. So to break that rather crazy term down a little bit, psycho, obviously psychological, anything to do with thought processes, the mind. So mental activity and emotional states. Neuro relates, anything with the prefix neuro relates to the nervous system. So we're looking at the brain, the spinal cord, and all the nerves that branch off from that. And we'll break that down a little bit more in a moment. And then immunology refers to our immune system. So our immune system is our defense system. It's how we manage threats in the world. And that can be just a threat from a temperature change, say that we're going to be too cold or too hot, or it could be that we've got a cut on our skin and we've got the potential for bacteria to invade that. We've eaten something that is a potential threat to our body. We have to mount a defense against that. So the immune system is our defense system. Now, pretty much everything we're going to talk about today and every system in the body, its basic function is to keep us alive. All we're trying to do is survive our environment. So be that an attack from an obvious predator, or be it just a bacteria that we've breathed into our lungs and is going to give us a cold or something. So we need to be able to defend ourselves. So we now look at how those systems interact and how our thought processes are mediated via the nervous system and also our chemical messaging system through the bloodstream to affect and to activate our immune system to make a defense choice about whatever situation we're in. So we're going to break that down a little bit further. And let's have a little look at the nervous system. So the nervous system, as I mentioned, is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. That's known as our central nervous system. And then from the spinal cord, we have a branch left and right of nerves that come out all the way down the spine. And they go off and branch and branch and branch and branch and serve every corner of our body. And this slide is a little bit busy and there's a lot of information on there. It's there if you want to delve into it, but I'm going to give you the sort of the big picture overview of that rather crazy slide there. So essentially, there are two systems in our nervous system: our sensory system and our motor system. So our sensory system is the nerve endings that are the receptors for different senses around us. So that could be temperature from the skin, it could be touch, it could be smell, hearing, sight. So these are all our senses, and they're out there reading the environment. What's out there that could be a potential threat to us? That information goes from those sensory receptors up to the brain, and the brain then makes a choice and sends out signals via the motor system. So this is actually the downward pathway of our nervous system that sends signals to our muscles so that we can respond to whatever that sensory information is telling us. So say, for instance, it suddenly got very cold and your skin receptors are starting to register that drop in temperature. This could mean that our core temperature is under threat and our body can only exist within quite small parameters of temperature shift. So that information goes up to the brain. The brain can then send a signal to the muscles to maybe start to tremor. This generates heat. Therefore, we maintain our core temperature. So sensory information in and a motor response out. So this is how this two-way system. So it's got to come via the brain. There's another kind of division of our nervous system that's called the autonomic nervous system, and that's our automatic systems. So there are many things that happen in our body that we don't consciously control. Our heartbeat, our breathing. So if we had to tell our heart to beat, dum, da-dum, beat the heart, we wouldn't get very much done in a day, right? If we had to tell ourselves, breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out, we wouldn't get much done. Digestion. These things are all happening on a subconscious level, on an automatic level. And that automatic system has a couple of branches as well. And we're going to look at particularly today something called the sympathetic nervous system. And this is our fight or flight response. So this is, again, an automatic system that is going to help us make some choices in the face of a threat. Now, the brain really kind of labels this situation as some form of mortal threat, i.e. a threat to our lives. So this is a primitive system. So It could be that we're being attacked by a predator. A lion has suddenly appeared and we've got to make a choice about either fighting it or running away. Or it could be something that we read via our sensory system. So if we go back to that analogy that maybe our skin is registering an increase in temperature, it's getting a little warm, and I can smell a bit of burning and my eyes can see a little smoke drifting under the door. And then suddenly its sensory information coming in is going to add up to a potential fire. So we need to make a choice to either fight that fire or run away from it. So the body is going to mount a response to that. So what's going to happen in this fight or flight response is several physiological processes are going to kick into action. Our heart rate is going to go up. So it pumps blood around our system much more quickly. The blood is all going to be diverted to our muscles. So muscle tension increases. So now we're ready and primed to fight this predator or run away very, very fast. Our breath rate increases and our breath becomes more shallow. We start to sort of go into a more panting mode. Blood pressure increases. We get blood sugar released into our bloodstream. And the pancreas that normally secretes insulin to kind of modify the sugar in the bloodstream, that gets suppressed so that it doesn't modify the sugar, because the sugar is going to give us instant boost of energy. So basically the body is doing everything it can to give us the tools, the physiological tools we need to deal with whatever this threat is. And this is a fantastic system if we are about to get attacked by a lion or if we need to run away from a potential fire. However, this system still gets activated just in the presence of thinking about something stressful. So it could be that you're just stressing about an audition you've got tomorrow. Your body's going into this state. Muscle tension is increasing. The blood pressure is going up. Sugar is being released into the bloodstream. But there's no means of actually expressing that. There's no means of actually burning off those chemicals and using that muscle tension. So it just sits in the body. So we start to see how stressing about something, being anxious about something is going to, via those nervous system and chemical connections, is going to mount this physiological response, but it's not really appropriate in that situation. It's a disproportionate response because we haven't got to make that physical reaction to whatever's coming in. Now, one of the other things to bring the immune system into this, one of the other interesting things about that fight or flight response is that inflammation is increased in certain areas. So what is inflammation? So we tend to sort of label inflammation as this horrible thing. Well, it makes us sore and it makes our muscles ache. But actually it's incredibly important to us, and it defends us. It's part of our defense system. So here is a very typical scenario where inflammation is very, very useful to us. So this is a needle or a nail or something nasty there puncturing someone's skin. So if you've now got an open wound, remember our skin is a big part of our immune system. It's our defense system. It's the barrier between ourselves and the outside world. So if something has penetrated that, we're now open to attack from any bacteria that might be out there that want to dive into that open space and attack us. So what happens when we get an open wound like that is sitting in that skin layer, or the layer just beneath the skin, are some immune system cells that basically mount an attack on this invading, potential invading pathogens coming in through this open wound. And that comes in the form of inflammation. So we all know that. You get a cut, it gets red and it swells up a little bit. That's an inflammatory response where all these chemical mediators of inflammation are being thrown into that area to first attack whatever bacteria might be lurking there, but then also to form a matrix to bind up and plug that leak in our defenses. So inflammation is very useful to us. So how does this link to that fight or flight response? Well, if you're about to get attacked by a bear or a lion, one of the potential outcomes of that could be an open wound, right? You could get slashed by the claws of the bear and therefore have an open wound. So when we go into that fight or flight response, the body sort of launches a preemptive strike that in case we get an open wound as a result of this threat, we're going to produce a whole load of inflammatory chemicals just in case. So what we see when we're in stress mode is that inflammation increases. Inflammation is traveling around the bloodstream, so it's going everywhere. It hasn't got a specific site it needs to go to right now, so it's just hanging around in the bloodstream waiting to go where it needs to. So what that means is we're going to have extra inflammation potentially in our muscles. So we've now seen that stress has made our muscle tension increase, and it's made our inflammation levels increase. So we've now got a rather elevated situation in our muscles that actually predisposes them to injury. So when muscles are tighter and already inflamed, it's going to take a lot less to make them sore and unhappy after a couple of hours of playing, versus if you weren't in that psychological state. So hopefully now we're seeing how the state of mind is affecting the physiological environment in which our body is working. So this is really important to understand. And again, this is rather a complicated slide here, but it just shows that all these chemical processes are activated when we're in stress mode, in an anxious state. These chemicals are produced in the brain. They activate that sympathetic nervous system. They trigger release of adrenaline from our adrenal gland, and we go into that fight or flight response. So electrical activity, chemical activity as a result of a psychological state changes the physiological environment. And what you'll see on that slide under where it says stress, early adversity, so interpersonal conflict, social isolation, these are some of the things that program us for stress. So stress can exist in the sense of a one-off scenario. There's a threat to you and you go into that stress response. But stress can also be a learned response. We can be conditioned for stress. And if we're looking particularly at the student environment, young children, their emotional and therefore immune systems are being programmed by their experiences in childhood. So it's the same as Pavlov's dogs, if you're all familiar with that study in conditioning, that you ring a bell and then give the dogs food, ring the bell, give the dogs food, and after a while you just have to ring the bell and the dogs begin to salivate because they're anticipating food, even if they're not going to be fed. They've been conditioned. That's called a conditioned response. So what we can see is that some of these exposures in early life to adverse events can actually program a child to have a stress response that is very, very heightened, and it takes very little to trigger it. And we're going to look at that in a little more detail. What is early childhood adversity and how does that program people for increased stress? But we're going to look at some facts and figures that come just from general studies of general population. But when we see those, we'll see how it kind of makes our music student population particularly vulnerable to this. So this is a study. So just, talking about the emotional practice environment. Now, hopefully we've got all that information to understand why it's important to consider this in, what is the emotional environment in which that student is coming to your lesson that day. And it may be, yes, that they're stressed out about an audition coming up or a particular piece that they're finding very difficult. But it may be that stress is totally unrelated to playing their instrument, but it's still in their bodies. They're still bringing that with them into the practice environment. So we need to be mindful and aware just as you wouldn't allow them to sit and play their instrument with their shoulders up round their ears, you'd say, oh, maybe you want to relax those shoulders. You also shouldn't be allowing them to play that instrument if their mind is busy stressing about something else. We need to manage that situation a bit, and we'll talk a bit about how to do that. But coming back to these early childhood experiences, adverse experiences. This is a study from the American Academy of Pediatrics back in 2012 that actually states this in clear terms. So early experiences are built into our bodies. Significant adversity can produce physiologic disruptions or biological memories, interesting words there, that undermine the development of the body's stress response systems. So we start to see disproportionate responses. They also affect the developing brain, the cardiovascular system, because remember that heart rate is activated by stress, the immune system, we've seen how that's connected into all of this, and metabolic regulatory control. So a lot of the systems of the body are controlled by our metabolic system, and that can get scrambled as well. So these sorts of physiologic disruptions are increased risk of adverse health outcomes in adulthood. So we're looking at not only the fact that being stressed is not a happy place to be, but it has direct effects on health risk in later life. So we're looking at just their own health, regardless of being a musician or anything else. And these studies, as I say, are not done specifically on musicians. This is just general population. So we now know this is established fact. Then there's a very interesting study that was done by Dr. George Slevich, who is at the UCLA Stress Lab, and he is a psychiatrist who works in this field of psychoneuroimmunology. And he did a very interesting study recently that looked at adolescents and looked at adolescents who had been exposed to some form of social stress. So what that can be broken down into is social isolation, so feeling that you're not part of the gang, targeted rejection, and targeted humiliation. So again, this was general population. They were looking at people, particularly with social media and the effects that can be having on people feeling like they're being judged all the time or being rejected. But basically, adolescents who had been exposed to these kinds of social stresses had health risks for later life that are greater than those for smoking, for alcohol abuse, and for physical inactivity. So these are three things that, we have poster campaigns about, right? That smoking is going to severely affect your health in an adverse way. Alcohol abuse, the same way. If you're not physically active, it's going to increase your health risks in life. But where's the poster campaign that talks about the social stress being a higher risk than any of those things? Well, they also showed that there is a 20-fold increase in the risk of depression. And here we go, leads to increased inflammation in the body. And inflammation running rampant in the body predisposes us to things like autoimmune conditions and gut disorders. Gut disorders are inherently linked, as we now know, to depressive disorders. There's the gut, what's known as the gut-brain axis. What goes on in the gut has chemical effects that alter mood states in the brain. It also activates areas of the brain that are involved in the experience of pain. So people who are in this stressful state have a heightened increase in the experience of pain. So they are hypersensitized to pain. So when we look at these social stresses, social isolation, how many young music students spend hours on their own in their practice room who don't really do the same levels of social activities with their peer groups because they've got to practice. They've got this whole other world outside of school that they need to spend targeted time on. And then Targeted rejection, competitions, juries, auditions, didn't get it, didn't win, didn't achieve. Rejection. Targeted humiliation. I'm absolutely sure that everyone that's dialing into this webinar, I'm preaching to the choir here. You're all people who are very aware of the importance of the teaching environment, but we do know there are teachers out there who use quite aggressive tactics, perhaps in a very well-meaning way. This is a tough profession, so we've got to make you tough. And how we do that? Well, you're going to get rejected, so we're going to reject you so you're well practiced in that. We're going to undermine you because you've got to be tough. But does endless rejection create somebody who is resilient to rejection? Does endless competition breed a good competitor? The answers are no, they don't. There are other ways that we need to be supporting these young individuals to go into this very volatile profession where they are going to be exposed to these things, but they need to be given the tools to learn how to be resilient in the face of that. So if we see how our population are particularly vulnerable to these kind of stresses, then we can see how this will affect injury risk in terms of that increased inflammation and tension in the body. So just to sort of talk about that heightened experience of pain, we talked earlier about our senses, sight, smell, hearing. When we go into fight or flight mode, that anxiety mode, and you can see with this little puppy here, you can tell his senses are all up, right? Eyes are wide and dilated, ears are back so that they can hear more acutely. So that animal is able to read a lot more of the environment. You dilate your pupils, you see more keenly, you hear more acutely. Pain is just another sense. So it's on that same circuit. So that volume dial has gone up on everything. So people who are living in a stressful state are hypersensitized to all senses, and that will include the sense of pain. So if someone's coming to me with an injury and they're particularly anxious about it, I need to know, well, how much of this pain they're experiencing is actually related to the level of tissue damage, and how much is being amplified by this anxiety response. And just by talking to them and saying, oh, you've got a bit of a tendon inflammation here, it's not a problem, we can deal with it. You start to manage the stress, manage their anxiety. And whilst they walked in with a 9 out of 10 pain in their arm, just after talking about it for a little bit, reassuring them that it's perfectly manageable, they're now at maybe a 6 or 7 out of 10. I haven't touched them yet, but just managing that information, bringing down the stress levels, has turned that volume dial down on the pain. And now we know a little more proportionately what the severity of that injury might be. So pain amplification is a feature of that stress response. So how do we deal with all of this? How do we make or create students that are resilient to the stresses that they're going to face in this profession? So it comes down to motivation. So those teachers I talked about who maybe try to motivate through the school of hard knocks, that's a different kind of motivation. There are sort of two camps for motivation. There's intrinsic motivation and there's extrinsic motivation. So intrinsic motivation is what it sounds like. It's motivation that comes from within. One of the things I often say to music students that I'm working with, particularly the ones who I see are quite anxious and a little stressed, is what made you pick up that instrument in the first place? Do you remember the first time you picked up an instrument? For a lot of little kids, it's a recorder, right, at school. And you picked that thing up and you were just blowing into it. You're making probably the most terrible noise, but you didn't care what it sounded like. It was just the joy of being able to blow into an instrument and create all these sounds. There was just a joy associated with that. And it didn't matter what anyone else thought about it. So that's often the catalyst for someone being drawn to an instrument, and then it's developing those skills to manipulate the sounds and have that control over it. So that gives you a sense of curiosity, of joy, and the joy of mastery and learning. But somewhere along the track, we start to get more motivated by external factors. Well, now you've got to go through an exam and you've got to pass a certain grade. You've got to go to a competition and there are trophies to be won. There are external rewards available. So we start to become motivated by the fact, I want to get that award. I want to win that place at that school. I want to be able to work with that teacher. So we're motivated by something external to us. And it doesn't just have to be a reward. It can also be a punishment, trying to avoid punishment. So we start to see fear of failure. Well, I've got to be good because I'm terrified of failing, because I'm going to let people down. I'm going to not meet the expectations of my parents or my teachers or my peer group. Fear of punishment. I'm going to get yelled at if I haven't reached that benchmark. So that's extrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation does not build self-esteem. And this is what we really need. Self-esteem is the golden key that students need in order to manage the rejection they're going to face in the profession, manage the stressful environment that they're potentially going into. But if they've learned to be extrinsically motivated, they're going to live in that fear response. They're going to live in that stress place. And so it's not just about performance anxiety when you go on stage. They're bringing that just into the practice room because they're thinking, if I don't practice for 6 hours today, I'm not going to meet the benchmark to be able to perform this piece well or meet the expectations of those around me. So we need to be reminding them of those intrinsic factors. We need to be getting back to the joy of why you did this in the first place, and making sure they're not being motivated by some external means. So to sort of get to the final part of this presentation, I just wanted to draw your attention to maybe some of the warning signs that a particular student might be falling into this category. What are the sort of things that you can look out for and maybe just flag up in a student that may be at risk? So some of the warning signs you might see: hypervigilant with notable tension. So that little kitty at the top there, that senses heightened again, you know, that sort of edginess. They come in and their eyes are quite wide and they have that sort of nervous energy about them. Fear is actually contagious. It's designed to be. So if you're sitting next to somebody and they suddenly go "Rah!" and ramp up a fear response, you better do it too, because whatever they've seen that might be about to attack them is probably going to attack you too if you're in close proximity. So this stuff is designed to be contagious. So if a student walks in with that edgy kind of nervous energy, you're probably going to feel it too. So if you start feeling a bit like, oh, why am I feeling edgy? It's probably because you're catching it from them. So that's a good way to just dial in and think, you know, do we want to be picking up or sitting at our instrument right now, or do we want to just manage this for a moment? So that's one expression of fear, but there are actually kind of two camps of fear expression. So one is that sort of fight or flight, that kitten at the top there. But you also get the opposite, where people become withdrawn and non-communicative. So there are certain animals in the world out there who actually play dead with fear, right? They just freeze and they actually almost paralyze themselves, so that a predator is going to assume that this is a dead animal and they're not going to bother with it. So we talk about fight, flight, and freeze response. So some might be at the opposite end of the scale, that they're just very withdrawn, they're non-communicative, they're just not engaging with you. Other things would be complaints of muscle soreness. So it may be, yes, that they practiced for too long the day before, but it could be that their muscles are sore because they're in that stress state, that elevated inflammation and muscle tension state. And then changes in behavior or skill. So, you know, the student was doing really well and now suddenly we've plateaued or we've gone backwards, and it doesn't seem to add up. It doesn't seem to be logical. You know, obviously things ebb and flow in training, but if it's something that just doesn't add up to you, it's maybe a time to question that slightly bigger picture. So strategies. creating an environment of openness so that this stuff is okay to talk about in your session. How are you feeling today? You know, just sort of making it, you know, there's so much stigma attached to, well, to injury in the music profession. People don't want to tell you that they're injured because they think they're going to be overlooked for promotion or overlooked for being selected for a particular concert. So people hide things, but particularly with mental states, there's such a stigma attached to anxiety and these things that people think there's something terribly wrong with them, so they don't want to share it. But if you can create an environment of openness where it's okay to discuss these things, just as we might discuss, well, why is your shoulder sore today? How are you feeling today? You know, are you feeling a little anxious today? Do you want to talk about that? And as I mentioned, if benchmarks are not being achieved, what's the bigger picture? Could this be a situation where the student is under some sort of stress? As I say, it may be related to their music life. It may not be. It may be something external. But at the same time, recognize your scope of practice. You know, this is something I hear from music teachers all the time. We're not social workers. We're not psychotherapists. You know, where is the line? Where is our scope of practice here? So the issue is that you guys are at the coalface. You're the people who see these students regularly. Often students are spending more time with their teachers than they do with their own families. So you can be the one to spot these changes, to fluctuations and potentially the changes in behavior. So it's always a great idea to build networks with mental health professionals that may be in your locality. And, you know, if they're not someone who understands musicians, have not been a musician themselves, invite them in to come and learn a bit more, come and sit in on a lesson, come and see a concert, come to our school and see what's going on, so that they can understand the environment in which these students are working, and then can start to develop support programs that will help with these issues. So just as if someone had a raging shoulder pain, you're probably going to send them to a PT or their GP. If they've got some changes in behavior and they're living with a lot of stress, you need to send them to someone who can help with that. So building those networks is great, so that you have someone that you can trust to send this person to. Obviously, if it's a child, you're going to have to speak to parents about this as well. But just as general strategies, useful things to do. So one of the things I do for students, or suggest that they do, is I say in all the practice rooms there's normally a trash can, right? So when you go in, maybe you're going into your lesson, or it may be that you're just going into practice on your own. Check in on your emotional environment. What's going on in your mind? Are you carrying some sort of stress or baggage into that practice room with you? You need to throw that out before you pick up or sit at your instrument. So do not begin to play your instrument if you've got that in your mind, because we know you're already in a muscle tense state. You're already in an inflamed state. So I teach them strategies for breath management and other calming strategies that they can just center themselves, just put aside whatever the stress is that they're dealing with at the time, and make sure they're not carrying that into their practice. I have all my students write an essay in their first semester that just explores some of their relationships to their instrument, to music. And there was one chap who wrote this beautiful essay about the journey he takes every morning to opening his trumpet case. And he's had this whole ritual. If he'd wake up and think, I'm not good enough, I'm not going to do well today, and he'd have to have his coffee, have his shower. It was like a little ritual he had to go through, that all built up to the moment he flicked the latches on his trumpet case. And as he opened the case, this overwhelming sense of inadequacy and fear would overwhelm him. And, you know, I was in tears reading some of these essays. That this is a reality that a lot of these students are living with. We're dealing with a highly perfectionist population, and this stuff they're carrying with them every day. So they need to learn to clean that emotional environment and be taught strategies to do that. So that's one thing they can do. Just be mindful of what they're bringing into the practice room with them, and don't be carrying that into their physical activity with the instrument. So these 3 words are just, again, some useful ways of just examining a little bit about people's approaches to playing their instrument. We talk about paying attention to things. We've talked today a lot about tension. Those things have almost a sort of static feel to them. We pay attention. It's like a fixed thing. Muscle tension is a fixed thing. But actually, when we look at the origin of these words with the ten kind of prefix in them, it comes from the Latin verb tendere, which actually means to reach or stretch towards. So there should be motion in this idea. And so I prefer to say to students, rather than paying attention or playing with tension, play with intention, because intention has motion in it. It's not fixed, it's not held. Playing an instrument is all about motion and movement. So don't pay attention, play with intention. So it's just a little kind of trick I use that I thought I'd share with you in case that speaks to you and can be useful. And when you see someone's shoulders rising up as they're playing, say, okay, can we go for intention rather than that tension? Okay, and that just kind of often speaks to them in a way, rather than just saying drop the shoulders or stop being tense. You know, one of the worst things people do is shout relax at you. You know, kind of has the reverse effect. So you want to go for intention, not tension. So that kind of wraps up the talk for today. My contact details are there, and I also have a book that kind of expands on some of these things and looks at all performing artists and how what we do with our craft and what the profession throws at us can actually affect whole body health. So feel free to dip into that if you want some further reading. And as I say, these slides will be available on the MTNA website, so that you can go back and find some of those references as well to those research papers, because they're also really good further reading. Good. Well, I will now go and have a little dive into this chat box that's been zooming away as I've been talking, and see if what questions you had. So I'm just going to whiz back to a little earlier and see where the questions start. Lots of hellos. Let me see. So there we go. How do you deal with perfectionists? Okay. So I'm going to, if you've all written my details down there, as I say, you'll get them from the website anyway. I'll bring myself back up so I can be a bit more face to face with you. Let me turn that off. There we go. So how do you deal with perfectionists? Yes. So perfectionism is, again, something that is quite widespread in our profession, and it's something that comes with a lot of anxiety as well. So we need to be mindful that these guys are falling very particularly into the camp that we've been talking about today. So perfectionism comes down to that those 2 types of motivation we were talking about. So there's a lot of arguments in the literature around perfectionism that talks about, well, is perfectionism always a bad thing, or can it be a good thing? And so there's actually 2 terms for perfectionism that have been brought up because of this argument, and they tend to categorize it as adaptive perfectionism and maladaptive perfectionism. So adaptive perfectionism is more about a kind of a will to achieve, a striving to achieve, which is kind of necessary. We do need to be motivated to do well. But when we get into maladaptive perfectionism, this is where we're starting to see the negative effects, that's negative self-talk, the stress response coming in, and it's dangerous. You know, this is something that leads to, in extreme cases, to self-harm and even suicide. So we do need to be mindful that perfectionism has a very negative end to it. So we tend to sort of reserve the term perfectionism for when it is maladaptive, and the other people are just have a conscious will to succeed, or are striving to succeed. So it comes back to, as I say, that motivation we were talking about. Perfectionists are basically motivating themselves to achieve through some fear of punishment, that if I don't do well, something bad will happen to me, rather than I'm doing well because I just enjoy what I'm doing. And so they're not able to let go of negative experiences that happen in performance. Say they performed and missed a note, or didn't, went wrong at some point in it, and they will catastrophize about that. That will create a physiological response in them that is concomitant with mortal threat. So they get this disproportionate response, and then they live in this stress state. So if somebody is very much in that category, they really need to have some help from a psychotherapist to deal with that. Just as if it was a shoulder injury, they'd be going to a PT. They need someone professionally to help them with that if they're at the far end of the scale. But even just talking about this stuff to them, so I do a class on perfectionism and just explain what it is, explain these different forms of motivation, and just get the students to check in with that. When you're feeling anxious, I always say to them, if you miss that note in performance, will it kill you? Well, no, unlikely. But the level of stress you're experiencing is concomitant with mortal threat. So we need a more proportionate response. We need to be able to forgive ourselves and to reset and let that go, and not hold on to that experience. And often perfectionism can be triggered by a one-off negative experience where they did a concert that didn't go well, and that created this pattern. And it is just like a software program that's running, and it needs reprogramming. And whilst we can help to a certain extent, if it's quite an ingrained program, they really need to have professional psychological support to be able to reprogram their responses to their perfectionism. So it's quite a big topic, but hopefully that's given you a few pointers there. Let's scroll down, see if we've got another one. Do you use a word awareness instead of attention, intention? Wonderful. Yes, awareness is great. Musicians often not very self-aware. They're aware of their sound. When I'm talking about the body, and we're learning anatomy and things, musicians are not very aware of their own bodies. And their mental states, they're probably aware of them, but they don't necessarily connect, like we've talked about today, the fact that they're maybe stressed and anxious will have an effect on their playing, on their injury risk. And it actually, by bringing their awareness to that, it actually motivates them to pay more attention, as we were talking about before, to that, bring their awareness to it, that they start to be more global in their approach to playing, rather than just focusing on the end outcome of the sound. So yes, so awareness is a wonderful word. So thank you for bringing that one in. I apologize, I've got the Californian sun coming through the window now. I've got a little bit of sun in my eyes. Have you done much work with mindfulness meditation as it relates to musicians? So yes, this is great. So there's a wonderful wealth of modalities out there to help people manage stress and anxiety. Mindfulness meditation, wonderful approach. Yoga can be great. There are lots of things that I recommend to students. I tend to teach them about these things on a sort of we only get one class on this stuff out of the whole semester. So I start to introduce them to these topics, but then direct them to places that they can find resources for that, or find practitioners who do that. At the Colburn School, there are yoga classes that are free. for the musicians to go to. But yes, there are lots of practitioners out there who actually specialize in things like meditation and mindfulness for musicians, so they can make it quite context specific for musicians. So that it's always worth reaching out to anyone in your environment who may practice these things and offer classes to, so that again you can direct students that you feel may be vulnerable to those resources. But yes, absolutely. Another question: how do we increase intrinsic motivation in our students? So it's a tricky thing to do, because this may be a pattern that's been conditioned, as we talked about, into them from other experiences, from the family environment even. But I think it comes back to creating that environment that in this room you are totally free to make mistakes. You cannot learn anything unless you make mistakes. If you think of a little baby who's learning to walk, they fall over all the time. They're pushing the boundaries. Oh, I pushed too far, so this time I'll push a little bit less. We can't learn unless we make mistakes. And so, you know, mistakes are often seen, coming back to that perfectionist thinking, often seen as, you know, this terrible thing. I mustn't make a mistake. It's like, you have to make a mistake. That's how the body learns. The nervous system has to find the boundaries. Too much, the Goldilocks, too much, too little, just right. We can't find just right until we found too much and too little. So creating an environment where they make a mistake and you go, great, that was wonderful. Now tell me what went on there. What was, you know, how did that feel to you? How could you change that? So you turn the mistakes that they perceive they're making into an opportunity to learn. I even say that with injuries. When they come to me with injuries, I'm like, brilliant, you're going to learn so much from this. You're going to learn a lot more than someone who hasn't had this injury, and you're going to then have the armor to manage yourself going forwards. So I think that's really the key thing that as a teacher you can do, is to create that environment of openness, that it is a place to test the boundaries and to go wrong, and to enjoy going wrong and enjoy the process of figuring out how to address that. Another one here, your last statement was playing with intention and what? So I said, really, it was just that, to play with intention versus paying attention or playing with tension. So intention, often with piano students, for example, who are coming to me with hand problems, I talk about, you know, you're not creating the sound at the point of contact. The mechanism of the piano action is deep in the instrument. So your contact with the instrument has to be, the intention has to be through the instrument and out. So that's another sort of way of describing it to them, and that your music comes from in you, it passes through your arm, and the intention is out through the instrument. So it's something that has travel, has motion. When we're in stress mode, tension mode, we're in holding, and that creates, you know, problems for the muscles, but also creates tension, that you lose dexterity in the fingers, you lose speed and sensitivity. So just that sort of concept of intention is what I use. So that was the only that was the one I choose to use. Have we got another one? Time for one more, I think. How do you help a student find intrinsic motivation when they're forced to take lessons by their parents? Yeeks. Okay, yes. So, you know, most children's emotional experiences are programmed by their primary caregivers. So, and I'm sure we've all had experiences of those parents who can be a little challenging in that regard. So again, you can only manage what you can manage, right? So if you're having time with them, you can just say, well, in this space, this is how we're going to do this. This is how we're going to handle this. And then, you know, I'm often in this situation where, you know, students come to me and I say, you need to think like this. Oh, my teacher doesn't let me do that, or my parent doesn't let me do that. So I say, well, okay, you know, you need to do what you need to do to manage that situation with the teacher or the parent, but you need to do it from a place of awareness. I've talked to you about what's happening in your body when you're in that situation. So we're going to learn to find that calm place in the body. What does that feel like to you? Can you reproduce that at will? So that when you go into that situation, if you're opening that door to the room where the person in there is maybe going to trigger you into that stress response, it's your job to not allow that into your body. So training them to actually find that sense of calm. What does that feel like in the body? So it's something tangible they can connect to. And then when they're in that situation and they're hearing whatever they're hearing from there, they are able to filter it from a place of more objectivity, really, that they are able to say, I'm not going to let that dial everything up in my body. I'm going to let it pass through me, and I'm going to acknowledge it. This is what I need to be in right now. I don't have to let that in. Much easier said than done, but you can help them to manage that. And that's a great life lesson. I work with a lot of people with anxiety and who have certain people who trigger them. And, I say, you have to dial up the emotional state that you want. Don't let them dial up what they want in you, so that we get the locus of control back. So one of the greatest stress and anxiety relievers is control and information, not inflammation. So when we understand, we have information, and when we have control, I am in control of my body state, it gives us a power that means that we're more resilient to those personalities, shall we say, around us. Great lesson for any environment that you end up in life, music notwithstanding. So that would be my advice. So we're actually bang on 10 o'clock. I've just one more question. Any tips for helping adults who struggle with tension? Same stuff, learn to find how it feels in your body to be calm, to let that stress go. And that's something then that you can dial up at will. I actually have a series of podcasts. I'm happy to share that link with MTNA as well. And I've got several on that sort of thing. I've got one called Who's Got Your Remote? Who are those people that push your buttons and make you stressed out like that, and how to manage that? So I'm happy for them to share those as well if they're useful, but there's a few on that topic. So thank you all very much for joining me, and I hope you found that useful. As I say, if any questions pop up afterwards, feel free to either email me, or those messages can be passed on via the MTNA website as well. And I wish you all the best with your students, and go out and have a very calm and chilled out day. Thank you very much.